All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Campbell with the Food Institute, and welcome to our webinar, Probiotics, Consumer Perceptions and Opportunities. To start, I'd like to thank our sponsor for today's webinar, and that's Hansen. Hansen is a global bioscience company that develops natural solutions for the food, nutritional, pharmaceutical, and agricultural industries. In their effort to grow a better world, they develop and produce cultures, enzymes, and probiotics for a rich variety of foods, beverages, dietary supplements, and animal feed. And you can learn more at www.chr-hansen.com/en. And yes, I'll be putting a link in the comments for that website as well. I'd also like to take care of a little housekeeping. A recording of this presentation will be shared with all registrants and attendees. Please allow a few days for processing and keep an eye on your inbox for that email later this week. And time permitting, we'll be hosting a short Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A tab on the side of your screen. I want to stress this, you get an opportunity here to talk to two experts and get direct feedback, so please engage as soon as you can. And now I'd like to introduce today's panel. First, we welcome Dr. Gregory Layer. He's Hansen's Senior Director of Scientific Affairs within the Human Health Business Unit. His current responsibilities include discovery research using various preclinical tools, as well as human intervention trials. Greg has published multiple papers in the areas of probiotic clinical benefits, application know-how, and microbial safety parameters, and received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And we also welcome Jordan Breslauer, Vice President of Data Analytics and Customer Experience at Social Standards, a company whose technology enables customers to develop next-generation business and investment strategies rooted in the voice of consumers. Jordan has been with the company for 3 years, playing an integral role in the product's evolution and carving out the core use cases that drive customer success. And with that out of the way, I'll hand it over to Dr. Layer to get us started. So over to you, Doctor.
Wonderful. Thanks for the introduction. Super happy to be here and talk about one of the topics I'm extremely passionate about, and that being probiotics. I thought what we would do to start the webinar would just be to level set on some of the definitions that you might be familiar with or have heard of. And so we'll go through pro, pre, syn, and postbiotics to differentiate what they are and what they do and what they don't do. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the human microbiome, defining that so we have a common understanding of what the human microbiome is. And we'll speak to some probiotic science along different demographics and where probiotics can play a role in the different life stages that we all encounter. And then I'll wrap it up with some interesting consumer insight data that Hansen has just sponsored. We've just received this data, and it's interesting to understand the consumer perception, and it'll dovetail nicely into Jordan's presentation. So first, if we talk about probiotics, there is no legal definition of a probiotic, but there are consensus definitions that are widely acknowledged in the scientific and commercial communities. And a probiotic definition would be a live microorganism that, when administered in adequate amounts, confers a health benefit on the host. And there's a few key words here, one being live. That's critical when we talk about some of the other definitions and other health ingredients that are out there. But to create the organism, maintain its viability over shelf life in a variety of food, dietary supplement applications, requires a lot of know-how. So that's a key parameter of the probiotic definition, is that you're consuming live organisms. And a probiotic is not just a common bacterium. A probiotic, to be considered a probiotic, you should have the clinical documentation to show that you provide a health benefit. And the host, as we speak today, is humans, but there are microbial supplements that are used in animal feeds as well that provide benefits in weight gain and feed efficiencies and things like that, and warding off infections. So being alive, being administered in adequate amounts, and then conferring a health benefit is what a probiotic is. You might have heard of a term called prebiotic, very similar in spelling, but different in its utility. A prebiotic refers to a substrate that's selectively utilized by microbes in the gut predominantly. So prebiotics that you might heard of that are used in foods and some dietary supplements would be FOS, or fructooligosaccharides. These are longer chain sugar units that are not necessarily digested by the human body, but are digested by microbes, and more importantly, selective microbes that live within our gastrointestinal tract. So FOS would be one, inulin, XOS. There's a variety of prebiotics, and prebiotics by themselves have their own health benefits. And then you get to synbiotics. So synbiotic would be that combination of a probiotic and a prebiotic, creating a synbiotic. And there's a couple of different ways to conceptualize these. One would be a complementary synbiotic, where it is just that, a probiotic and a prebiotic. The probiotic may not utilize that prebiotic, but the prebiotic by itself has benefits to the human host. And they're combined together in a product format and delivered to the consumer. Uh, a synergistic symbiotic would be one that the prebiotic and the probiotic have been hand selected to work together in the body, where the prebiotic might be utilized by the probiotic as a selective food source. And by feeding that prebiotic, you're, elevating the numbers of the probiotic in the gastrointestinal system. So that would be an example of a synergistic symbiotic. And then last but not least is a postbiotic. And although I won't be speaking about these in any extent today, it's relatively newer to the marketplace. It been on the market in other parts of the world for decades. But a postbiotic refers to essentially a killed preparation of bacteria. And so you can imagine a heat killed, a heat treated probiotic all of a sudden not being viable anymore, but does it still have a health benefit? And so to be considered a postbiotic, you would need to demonstrate that you have some health benefit. So one of the key differences would be we know that cell structures, so on the outside of a bacterial cell wall, they are immunoregulatory. They interact with our human immune system. And that may be enhanced actually by heat treatments. But what you don't get in a postbiotic is the active metabolism of the probiotic organism in the body. So there's pros and cons. You have a stability advantage because you're not needing to maintain the viable nature of the organism, but you're not also getting all the complete benefits of the organism. So that's all I'll say about postbiotic. I just wanted to throw that definition out there in case there was some confusion over pro, pre, syn, or postbiotics. So now that we've level set on these terminologies, I'd like to just speak briefly about the microbiome and some of these benefits that these natural bacteria have in our body. And for those of you on the call, you might be very well aware that we're outnumbered bacteria to human cell on our bodies, right? We're largely a reservoir of bacteria. Um, and we have a very synergistic relationship. They provide a lot of benefits. So if we go clockwise from the 12 or 1 o'clock position, these microorganisms certainly are involved in digestion, utilization of foodstuffs that the human body can't digest, but the bacteria can. There's vitamins that are synthesized the human body needs, and they're only available through bacterial synthesis in our body, as well as regulation of nutrient metabolism. We know that the vast majority of immune cells in the human body reside in the lining of our gastrointestinal tract. And so this immune system that we've evolved over eons senses friend from foe, and these bacteria interact directly with these immune cells, and the immune system then can communicate whether to mount a response or whether to consider it a friend. And so in most of the human clinical interactions and the human clinical benefits that have been studied, there typically is an immune component, and you'll see this resonate very well with consumers in terms of what do they understand probiotics to benefit. They understand it to benefit digestion or gut health, as well as immune health. And then there's areas outside of the gut that these bacteria can have benefits in. So when we think about cardiovascular health, there's probiotics that have been shown to reduce LDL cholesterol, for example, and they do that through interaction with bile acid metabolism in the gut. One of the emerging areas that we see is in the area of the gut-brain axis. So, and I'll speak about this in a few slides. Do probiotics have the ability to affect stress, anxiety, more severe mental disorders? And the answer is that they very well might. And then there's some work on modulation of bone mass, and this is more through an immune component, but regulating that. So you can see these bacteria, collectively referred to as the microbiome, influence a lot of areas of health that we would be in very bad shape without. So when we speak about how the insights of the gut microbiome and probiotics are influencing each other, it's fairly intuitive that this is a relatively newer area of study. I would say in the last decade or two, the number of probiotic publications are rapidly increasing on a daily basis. When I started in the industry, there was roughly 1 to 2 clinical studies published a year in probiotics, and now there's more than one published a day. So the interest globally in how these bacteria can influence human health is increasing, and that's corresponding directly with our understanding of what we call the microbiome. So, this more complex community of bacteria, viruses, protozoa, et cetera, that live in and on us, how the microbiome influences health. And so, between the two, the increased understanding of the microbiome, how probiotics can influence the microbiome, is leading towards a much greater appreciation of the role that these bacteria and other living things have on human health. And they will just continue to work together. Typically, microbiome evaluations are part of most probiotic clinical studies these days. And the advancement of molecular tools has certainly helped that. And when we think about microbiome and probiotics, they're not the same, so I don't want to always group them together. But we also know that there is a life stage component whereby bacteria are imprinted in the newborn infant, and it's different by way of birth. A different microbial composition is inoculated into that infant, whether it's a vaginal childbirth or a cesarean section childbirth. We know that very early in life, the infant microbiome is dominated by a relatively small number of bacteria. And I'm highlighting a couple of genuses here, Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus. And we know within the first 2 years of life that microbial composition resembles something much more adult-like. But we also know that over the course of life, there's a variety of environmental, nutritional, pharmaceutical factors that influence our overall microbial composition, whether we're going through periods of stress, whether we're taking antibiotics that um, are like a shotgun approach and will kill not only the targeted organisms if you have an ear infection, for example, but might also disrupt your gut microbiome. And how quickly will that be restored back to a healthy place? So, and we also know that as we age and we get on into our elderly years, we see key genuses declining in compositional numbers. And we've been able to show through clinical intervention trials that restoring those numbers to a healthier balance improves immune parameters, et cetera. So there's different demographics within the entire lifespan of the human where these organisms can play, and whereby we can design custom products depending on what life stage we're trying to target. When we speak about clinical documentation of probiotics, and this is specifically speaking to the Christian Hansen portfolio, at least those in the dark blue bars would represent strains that are offered in the Christian Hansen portfolio. You can see that we have a dominant share of the documented strains that are out there. Our legacy goes back a long time. We have a very broad portfolio. And again, I'll get into some of the different demographics that it targets, but it really targets everything from pregnant mom and infant all the way through advanced life stages and ages. But we're devoted to continuing to invest in science. And if you haven't guessed, I get excited talking about it. I just want to give you a couple of slides as we walk through the life stages. So examples of clinical work. So here's a case where we're looking at very young children that are suffering from colic. And those of you that are parents that have had a colicky baby understand it's not just the baby that's disrupted by colic, right? The parents and the caregivers are significantly affected by colic. One of the measurements we can look at is the number of children that have greater than a 50% reduction of crying and fussing, which is a nice way of saying colic symptoms, over a short period of time after the administration of one particular organism, in this case, BB12. The application is interesting because, a baby's not going to want to chew a capsule, for example. So in this case, it's in a little probiotic oil dropper where a few drops are applied to the baby's tongue. And that's how the probiotic is administered and gets ingested and then interacts with the gut mucosal immune system. So this is an example of a really nice study done in infant space. If we look at a little bit older in children, one of the areas that is tested in children is their ability to ward off infections. So respiratory tract infections, cold and flu symptoms, et cetera. And this is one study amongst many that have looked at children in a daycare setting and the ability of probiotic organisms to prophylactically ward off secondary infections, so respiratory tract infections. And again, this is just a nice way to show that probiotics have the ability to maintain this healthy lifestyle. If we move into adults, one of the more common complaints would be irritable bowel syndrome or IBS. And the predominant measurement of IBS is pain. Abdominal pain drives all these health-related quality of life subjective questionnaires. So pain is the key component in IBS, and very well-powered studies have been done recently looking at the ability of a probiotic bacterium to affect pain, amongst a whole host of other things, which would be a webinar in itself. But in this particular graph, you're looking at day 0, pain ratings about the same between the placebo group and the active group, containing one that are soon to be administered one particular microorganism. And then you see this roughly 36% reduction of abdominal pain severity after 6 weeks. And it's important to note, and we'll get into gut brain and psychosomatic health outcomes, there's typically a placebo response. And so you always want to do your statistics looking at the benefit that you're seeing in comparison to any placebo response. And so these were very statistically significant benefits above and beyond any type of placebo response. And then I want to just speak a little bit about women. There's a preponderance of evidence that talks about a healthy vaginal microbiome. So I mentioned earlier on that bacteria live in and on us. We're outnumbered by bacteria. Bacteria are going to be associated with any epithelial cell surface that's exposed to the environment. So it starts in the mouth and works on down south. The largest collection of bacteria in the human body would be located in the large intestine. And in women, there's a microbial community and a healthy microbial community that resides in the vaginal cavity. And that microbial community is responsible for keeping it in an acidic environment, warding off yeast or UTI pathogens. And when that community becomes out of order, they can also benefit from targeted probiotics. And so some of the work that's been done in our group, we have a brand called Urex. This is a 2-strain combination. It's been shown to reduce yeast overgrowth. It's been shown to support bacterial balance in the urinary tract and ward off urinary tract infections. It's been shown to take women that have maybe an elevated pH and reduce that pH to a normal range and improve Nugent scores, et cetera. So the point of this slide is really to mention that probiotics are more than just digestive and immune health. Here's an area of vaginal health for women that have been shown through a large number of clinical trials. And I want to spend just a few seconds on some emerging areas. So we speak about the gut-brain axis. And for those of you that might not be familiar with this term, it's referring to this bidirectional communication that happens between the brain and the gut. And there's multiple ways this can happen. There's the nervous system, the vagus nerve innervates the gut and derives from the brain. There's the neuroendocrine pathway, whereby bacteria have been shown to either produce neuroactive components like GABA, or they induce our intestinal epithelial cells to secrete serotonin, for example. And then there's an immune component, and inflammation seems to be at the root of a lot of these areas. And if we look at where clinical documentation is moving, there's more mild areas like improving stress or mood, feelings of stress or mood or anxiety. And there's much more severe areas like severe depression, mania, bipolar disorder, autism, that are also being tested through microbiome and microbiology interventions, probiotic interventions. So the mechanisms are quite varied. but the results are really encouraging. And I speak about this as being an emerging area only because it's not like this area has been tested for 25 years, like perhaps digestive health. But some of the areas that we have some data would be, if we again start clockwise, we'll start in the top right. There's data that shows a blunting in stress hormone spikes when you're experiencing stressful situations like a work shift change. So this was a study where we looked at working a daytime shift to a nighttime shift and the stress that involves. And probiotics were shown to blunt some of those stress responses, as well as improving scores of perceived stress in IBS studies, for example. In the lower right-hand quadrant, there's data that shows the benefits in much more severe situations. So these are people that were actively diagnosed with schizophrenia, and I'm not here encouraging product development for this patient population because this is more drug applications. But nonetheless, the data is really intriguing, where we showed less hospitalization and less recurrence rates when these patients were given probiotics. And again, it's through some of the mechanisms that I spoke about on the previous page, we think. Um, a key component of gut brain is sleep. I think Jordan might touch on this, where this is resonating with consumers. And we've got some studies showing benefits to sleep, which is probably linked to lower stress. And then another area of interest in gut brain is just general improvement in cognition. And in most studies with probiotics, you see the benefits of probiotics in the people that need most of the benefits. So in this area, and in this case, we saw improvements in cognition in subjects that had lower than normal cognition scores. So a wide variety of areas in the gut brain area that makes me really excited um, about the possibilities in the future in this emerging field. And then lastly, I want to just share a few insights with a global study, a global consumer understanding study of probiotics. To me, it's quite interesting to see the evolution of understanding in people, who are the active adapters of this, and what are some of the key parameters of their lifestyle that we can group them in. And so the biggest daily consumer groups are generally the groups ages between 25 and 56, so the millennials and the Gen Xers. The commonalities, these people are committed to self-care, generally live urban and busy lifestyles, like to be active and fit. They're aware of healthcare trends. They're curious people, and they have some disposable income to pay for this type of product. I've always been interested in who is disseminating the information and who do consumers go to get their information. So product recommendations are typically given by a trusted individual, whether that's a healthcare professional or a close friend, family member, coworker. That's where people are getting their product recommendations from. When they want to dive into more and get more information about products that contain probiotics, the logical place they go to are, again, those people that gave those recommendations, as well as internet searches. Um, to try to help people, consumers, healthcare practitioners, et cetera, improve their understanding of probiotics, Christian Hansen has launched the Probiotic Institute. It's a guide in general terms to what the microbiome is, what probiotics are, some recommendations on what to look for in probiotic products, et cetera. And so the question of what to look for is of interest to me, because there's always been consumer confusion. Not only what is a probiotic, but then you start getting into details at the strain level, for example. What do these little numbers and letters mean at the end of a strain? Is that good, bad? Is this a strain that's been clinically tested? How do I know this? And people that are looking for specific information on bacteria are looking because they want to know what they're ingesting. They want to make sure that there's a specific health benefit that's associated with the bacteria that's in that product. And that's the next step, I think, in the consumer evolution and the consumer understanding is, okay, they've gotten their head around the concept that eating bacteria might actually be good for me, but let me understand that not all bacteria are the same. How do I know which are the bacteria that have clinical tests behind it? And that's the challenge for all of us, right? To get that education out there. And I will just close in summary that, the exciting part of the microbiome, and probiotic and health connection will continue to play a key role for future probiotic solutions. We continue to exploit it, research it, develop it, but there's challenges. There's application challenges. We all know that, probiotic products that contain these documented strains, and we want to deliver it in a dose that's efficacious, but we need to keep them alive in these products. And whether you're talking about a fermented beverage, an acidic fruit juice, or a dietary supplement that's going to be stored, in this case, dry and on a store shelf for 2 years at room temperature, very different application challenges. And so those opportunities are out there to partner with people, like this company that has the expertise that can guide you through that. And so while consumers are still confused, I'll close in the middle to just try to segue into Jordan's talk. They're more and more aware of the health benefits that are associated and attributed to probiotics. And so with that, I'll hand the slide controls over to my colleague to take us the rest of the way.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Lair, and super, super interesting to get both that scientific perspective on probiotics, but also to get some really interesting survey research. As we go into my portion of the presentation, I think what we're going to be focused on here is the analysis of social media data as a method of better understanding the consumer. So while some of what Dr. Lair presented at the end there was concerned with a survey approach, what we're going to do is we're going to harness the collective intelligence that comes from social media, that comes from consumers willingly going on and talking about their experiences with probiotics on social media, and use those data points in order to better understand the consumer. So how do we do that? Well, here at Social Standards, we like to think of ourselves as the Nielsen of social, in that we structure social conversations from a variety of different sources in a very similar way to how Nielsen structures sales data. Nielsen has the benefit of UPC codes, which bring structure to their database. We don't. We have to create, in essence, linguistic UPC codes using a very complex proprietary technology in combination with a team of linguists whose sole job it is to take orders from the machine and classify and structure human language with all the ambiguity and nuance in the way in which people express themselves, whether that may be through different misspellings or colloquialisms that people use to say particular things, and accounting for the evolution and change in social vernacular as the world around us evolves. So today, we're going to be focused heavily initially on conversations around probiotics on Instagram. We're eventually going to transition later on in this to looking at a little bit of a comparison versus conversations around probiotics on Reddit. Beginning here, we're looking at the trend in probiotic conversation on the left side. And what we can notice here is that probiotics, they peaked early on in the pandemic, right around the March-April timeframe. Clearly at that point, people were really leaning in on particular health-related solutions. And so at that time, that benefited probiotics and many other types of health products in a similar way. Now you can see that trend has generally returned to pre-pandemic levels of engagement. It's kind of interesting. Each year you see a little bit of a bump up at the beginning of the year in January and a little bit of a decline around December. So people tend to engage less with different health products around the holidays. And then when the new year starts and they make commitments to new resolutions, they tend to lean back in those particular categories. On the right, we can also look at who talks about probiotics. And this aligned pretty well with the survey that you saw previously. What I think is interesting is a little bit of understanding of our approach to understanding who's talking about probiotics on Instagram in this case. You can see the breakdown by gender, age, race, and income. But I think it's really important to take into account that Instagram and food and beverage and health and wellness on Instagram, these categories tend to have their own particular skews from a gender, age, race, income perspective. And so you can see the column that says raw, that tells you what percentage of the conversations around probiotics come from a particular demographic cohort. So around 25%, give or take, come from men, while about 75% come from female. But one needs to consider when looking at this data that Instagram as a whole and food and beverage as a whole skews heavily female, younger, and white Caucasian. So we need some sort of normalization in order to account for the general skews of the source. And that's where percentiles come into play. 50th percentile, that tells us whether that's on par with expectation for the source in the vertical. If you're above that, you're overrepresentative of a demo. If you're below that, you're underrepresentative of a demo. And so what's unique in some way about probiotics, or notable about probiotics demographics, is that they tend to skew more female, 30 to 44, white Caucasian, and mid-income than other topics on food and beverage and Instagram. Now, I think it's interesting to account for the fact that this has evolved a bit over time. Here, what we're looking at is how probiotics conversations have trended amongst men, trying to understand if the percentage of probiotics conversations that are coming from men has grown or declined over time. And what's interesting here is you can see that trend shows that back in December of 2019, somewhere around 19 to 20% of all probiotics conversations came from men. And that's hopped all the way up to around 26% in the most recent months. So despite the fact that this is more of a female skewed category, it is clear that men are becoming more interested in probiotics. You could argue from this data, the interest is up about 30% over the last 24 months. So one of the really special things that we can do is dive into the types of things that people are talking about alongside probiotics. And that's really what's going to govern a lot of the rest of this investigation. If I want to make that analogy back to Nielsen, Nielsen can look at relationships in the way in which people buy. So somebody who might buy Coca-Cola might be more likely to buy Bounty paper towels. We can tell you relations in the way in which people talk and the way in which people think, arguably. So what we're going to be looking at here is when people are talking about probiotics, what are they talking about in general? Now, in this list, I isolated to topics that are overrepresented in probiotics relative to what you'd expect to see in food and beverage on Instagram. And that's important because there are just certain topics that are super frequently mentioned on Instagram in food and beverage. If I just did a frequency list, the word love would always come up because people, when they talk about things on Instagram, they generally really love them. They're passionate about them. And so what I'm doing here is I'm controlling our list for things that are over-indexed. The y-axis is helping us to gain an appreciation for that degree of over-indexing. You can see I think the lowest data point on that gets down to about 80 to 100th percentile. So really the most over-indexed topics. And then the x-axis is helping us to gain a sense of which of these topics are most frequently mentioned in probiotic conversation. And sure enough, what do we really see as the standouts here? Well, we see that gut health, digestive issues, and immunity really dominate probiotic conversations on Instagram. Now, there's a lot of other things that you'll see quite over-indexed on this list, which I think are some pretty interesting, more niche applications and use cases for probiotics that consumers are talking about, but just at a little bit of a lesser degree. Some of those include brain health and food allergies. Also, we see a little bit more towards the middle of this chart. We see that microbiome is over about 12% of total probiotic conversations. So certainly hearkening back to some of the points that Dr. Layer was talking about earlier. Now, I also think it's interesting. I don't necessarily show it in this deck, but you can see over here postbiotic in the top left-hand corner. That was something that Dr. Layer referred to earlier. And we actually see that that topic is up 196% year over year in probiotic conversations. So even though it's quite small still, it is a growing topic within probiotic conversations over the past year. Now, on this next slide, what I wanted to do was cluster together the different types of benefits and concerns that are mentioned in probiotic conversation. And this idea of clustering essentially takes all of these different over-indexed topics alongside probiotics and puts them on a map based upon their similarity to one another. So what this helps us to do is almost cluster the different motivations and use cases that drive probiotic conversation. And I think you can kind of split these up into 4 different groupings. But before I even go into that, I think it's just a little bit more of orientation for this chart. Think of it as a map. Don't overanalyze it. The highest point on it, think of in the top section, think of it like the North Pole, and think of the bottom section like Antarctica, and then west versus east. It's just about positioning. It is not about things being further to the right and higher up being better than other things. What I'm almost looking for is concentration here. So what do these different clusters indicate? Well, we see that there's one core cluster on this chart, cluster number 4 labeled there, which has the most meat on the bone per se. That is about digestive issues and gut health, and really harkens back to the previous slides where we talked about those being the real big drivers of the conversation. So kind of sits at the center of probiotic conversations. But there's a couple other notable fringe clusters here that I think are interesting. There's one that talks about the absence of ingredients, so free from things like low sugar or non-GMO or nothing artificial. There seems to be an overlap between probiotic and those particular segments. There's a smaller cluster towards the bottom that has to do with food allergies. Interestingly enough, that's another thing that we've seen grown over the past year, somewhere around 50 to 60% in probiotic conversations. And then we see another thing towards the top around immunity and inflammation. A little bit of a bigger cluster and also pretty close to some of the different digestive issues and gut health. So really interesting when you consider that, yes, digestive issues and gut health are at the center, but there are different things like free from food allergies and immunity and inflammation that are closely related that help to drive different aspects of probiotic conversation. Going next into a little bit of the different activities and hobbies that are present in probiotics conversation. And here I included both things that over-index, so are above that gray region on the Y, and things that are also under-indexed, so things that are below the gray region on the Y. So, and then the X once again is the ones that are most frequently mentioned. So some interesting things we see here. First of all, it's very clear that one of the big activities that seems to co-occur quite frequently alongside probiotic conversation, and I think really speaks to the lifestyle of this consumer, is fitness and exercising. In addition, though, there's another really notable one we see there that Dr. Layer was talking about earlier, and that's sleeping. Sleeping quite close even in terms of size to exercising, and also even more over-indexed. Now, it's also interesting here, you see a general under-indexing with things like cooking and baking and even traveling. So those are just less associated activities with the probiotic segment than things like fitness, exercising, and sleeping are. Now, thinking a little bit more about sleeping, earlier I was talking about some of the research that is shown that certain probiotics could help with with helping with sleep issues and helping therefore potentially helping people with their stress levels as well. Here we're looking at sleeping's presence within probiotic conversation and its overall trend. And what I think is interesting looking at this is how it's grown over the last 24 months. So over the last 12 months, it's up about 20% in probiotics conversation. And over the last 24 months, it's up about 42% in probiotics conversation. It seems that it was accelerated in some way by the pandemic. So you can see back in March of 2020, sleeping's presence within probiotic conversation grew all the way up to 7.2%. And since then, it's had somewhat of a steady increase within the conversation, becoming a bigger and bigger activity on social that's associated with the segment. Next up, I wanted to go and talk a little bit about the different products and preparations that drove probiotic conversation. So here, very similar format. We're just focused on the over-indexed products and preparations. Think about these as different food and drink that are co-occurring, and also vitamin, minerals, and supplements that are co-occurring alongside probiotics. We isolated to only the over-indexed ones. So in this one, I think the scale of the Y is from about 70 to 100. So 70th percentile to 100, all rather over-indexed. And the x-axis, once again, is about the most frequently mentioned products and preparations in probiotic conversation. And so 3 really stand out from both a over-indexing and size perspective. Those are supplements, being number 1, kombucha and yogurt really are the most prominent preparations and products alongside probiotics in consumer conversation. There's some other more niche over-indexed foods and beverages that have a smaller percentage of the conversation, however, are very highly associated with the probiotic segment. Those include kefir, kimchi, and sauerkraut. Now, I wanted to get a better understanding of how some of these were changing over time. So the y-axis here is giving us a sense of the size of that particular product category within probiotic conversation. So you can see supplements all the way up towards the top and about 30% of probiotic conversation, followed then by kombucha and yogurt. And the x-axis helping us to understand how it's changed year over year. So if you're to the right of that vertical line, you've grown in probiotic conversation. If you're to the left, you've declined in probiotic conversation. So essentially, supplements, kombucha, and yogurt still remain the kings, of course, but supplements have shown growth, while kombucha and yogurt, to a lesser extent, have shown a bit of decline in probiotic conversation. Now, much, much smaller, but growing very, very fast. You can see towards the bottom right-hand corner of the chart, collagen drinks are up about 155% in probiotic conversations. In addition, we also see functional beverages. So I think there is some opportunity, it appears, in functional concoctions and beverages that infuse probiotics. It seems like interest in those product categories has grown notably over the past year, although they do remain quite niche and quite small relative to that of supplements, yogurts, and kombucha. Now, one of the things that social standards is poised well to do is help companies think through different innovation opportunities. And as you think about the next places that probiotics could potentially be infused, one of the approaches we take is we go and look at what are the different types of product and preparation categories that are currently under-indexed alongside probiotics. And then we went and looked at amongst those things that are currently not associated, people don't think of probiotics and that thing at the same time. We went and saw which of those things have the greatest interest level amongst the probiotic consumer or those that talk about probiotics in general. So think about it this way. These types of things you see on this list, the probiotic consumer cares about them in general, but doesn't really talk about them alongside probiotics. And so here what we're showing is we're ranking that list of things that is under-indexed alongside probiotic conversations and seeing which of them is most over-indexed amongst the probiotic consumer. And you see protein balls, matcha tea, protein cookies. So a decent amount of different protein concoctions are appearing high up on this list as things that often under-index alongside probiotics, but are liked by the probiotic consumer. And therefore, if the infusion of that product with probiotics makes sense, that could arguably be an area of opportunity. And finally, I think this is really interesting, contrasting this with some of the insights that came earlier of who do people go to when they're trying to get recommendations on probiotics. Here, what we're looking at is the type of person that is mentioned in social conversations around probiotics, contrasting Instagram conversations with Reddit conversations. So any of the different person types you see here that are in green, so to the right side of that vertical line, are skewed towards the Instagram conversations. While anything you see in red is more skewed towards the Reddit conversations. And so overwhelmingly, we see on Reddit where the conversations get more detailed. People look for more feedback. They ask more questions. They get more into the science. We see a higher presence of more of those medical professionals, such as doctors, being mentioned more often. And I think that indicates that when people are going on Reddit, they're really trying to seek out what other people might have heard from their doctor or what might be the most doctor recommended products. On Instagram, it's a little bit different. And it's not to say that doctors aren't present on Instagram in terms of being mentioned in the conversations. It's just that what we see is more present is things like nutritionists and health coaches, things that people that generally have a little bit more presence within the Instagram universe and often are influencers in their own right. So it just helps to paint the picture of a little bit of the difference between the different social media in terms of the way people talk and interact with information around probiotics and the way in which they receive their information. And so with that, I wanted to thank everybody for joining and open the floor up to Q&A.
All right. I want to say thanks both Jordan and Dr. Layer here. We have a couple of questions from the audience. So I guess we'll start off. We have one, and I guess we could throw it over to Jordan to start. I'm not sure what your data shows you, but the question is the probiotics conversation and food allergy conversation influenced by people with dairy allergies or those who have to seek out vegan probiotics? So I'm wondering if your data shows any kind of subsets for that kind of population.
That is a great question. So one of the best parts about our tool is how agile it is. So I have it open right next to me. I'm going to take a quick look right now to help to answer that question. So the question comes back to, is it related to dairy allergies, that intersection? Yes. Got it. So what I see here is that there's a huge intersection between the two. So around 3% of total probiotic conversations mention dairy-free and non-dairy, and around 21% of all food allergy conversations mention dairy-free and non-dairy. Now, those data points alone don't mean much, but when you index those relative to all of food and beverage, both fall in the 90th percentile. And so that's a real indication that the overlap between the two is highly skewed, arguably, towards that dairy-free, non-dairy consumer.
Very interesting. I have a question that's probably best answered by Dr. Layer here. And the question was, what's the difference between spore forming and vegetative probiotics? And the follow-up question is, which one's used most by the dairy industry?
Sure. So the simple answer is most of the probiotics that have been studied over the course of the probiotic history have been the more vegetative cell forms. So the lactobacillus, bifidobacterium, etc. And the difference between those types of bacteria and a spore-forming bacterium is the easiest way to look at what a spore is to use the analogy of a plant seed, whereby a spore is a way that the organism has to deal with really challenging environmental conditions, and it'll create a dormant spore that will stay dormant or in suspended animation until the conditions are right for it to grow into a vegetative cell. So those are the key differences. The advantage of a spore is chiefly one of stability, where you can get a spore into product applications that would be extremely challenging for vegetative cells. And so any product application that would involve heat treatment would be something where you'd consider a spore versus a vegetative cell. But the vast majority of the clinical data is on vegetative cells, the traditional probiotics, and those are the types of cultures, because of their affinity for low pHs, they survive very well in dairy and fermented dairy products.
And I guess this is not a follow up from the same person, but probably best for you too, Dr. Layer. We have a question asking, what are some potential applications in dairy beyond yogurt that probiotics could be incorporated in?
In dairy, but beyond yogurt. Uh, the very first probiotic dairy product I think on the market was something called sweet acidophilus milk back in the 1970s. So that's just fermented milk with the probiotic in it. There are probiotics that could be used in cheeses. There's probiotics that could be used in ice creams. I think that the challenging part comes from linking a healthy attribute to a product that might be considered more decadent, like an ice cream or a full fat cheese product. But there are several dairy applications whereby probiotics would be very amenable.
Yeah, so just to add on to that, I think in our data from the consumer perspective, what is even currently over-indexed, we do see a lot of those non-dairy cheeses. So non-dairy cheese about 4 times more associated with probiotics than other topics in food and beverage. And kind of to add to that additional fermented milk comment, even some type of the non-dairy milks we're also seeing have some association. One that's super, super small, but still quite over indexed is tiger nut milk. I'd have to look into some of the science behind that, but certainly a continuous association that we see, although at small levels, over indexing levels relative to other topics on social media.
And another question we have coming in too is for the consumer side, if they're buying a product with probiotics in it, how would they know the amount that's in it? Is that something that's recognized on the label? How is that shared? Do you have any insight on that, Dr. Layer?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, not a problem. So the question was, how can a consumer know the amount of probiotics in a product like yogurt or kombucha or whatever they're buying?
Sure. And that I think that's a challenge in the food space. In the dietary supplement space, there's a supplement facts panel that typically lists out um, the number of organisms, as we call it, in colony forming units. In the food side, I think it's really challenging for the consumer because it's not delineated out normally unless the product is specifically designed to be a probiotic supplemented food. So, for example, some yogurts that I'm familiar with, or some fermented dairy drinks that are designed to deliver an efficacious level of probiotics will highlight that on the label. But kombucha is a different beast entirely. I mean, kombucha is typically what we call a natural or wild fermentation, whereby you're relying on the inherent bacteria in the materials that are fermenting to be the fermentor. Whereas in dairy products and things, you're adding selected organisms to do the fermenting because you want a particular organoleptic quality. So it's challenging. I don't have a really precise answer on food products like kombucha or dairy unless they're specifically designed to deliver a certain amount of probiotics. Then it would most likely be highlighted on the nutritional facts panel.
All right. I know we have about 5 minutes here, but I think I'm going to bring this to a close. We went through most of the Q&A there. I just want to thank Jordan and Dr. Layer again for sharing those insights. Really interesting conversation. Once again, I'd also like to thank Christian Hansen for sponsoring the webinar. And just a little bit of housekeeping here. Please keep an eye on your inbox for a recording of this webinar. It should be coming out in the next couple of days. But other than that, I just wanted to say thank you again to Jordan and Dr. Layer. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right. So let's have a great day, and we'll see you next time.